last section is on porches. Probably no other single element of a building has the potential to either add or detract more from a building than does the porch. I mean, the roof form, yes, but you don't go around changing roof forms too often. But porches are present on just about every house, at least up until through the 20s and 30s, and they had the potential to take a rather bland, blasé house and put a nice porch on it and really change the proportions and what that house can do. I'm not going to get into the sociology of porches, other than say the fact that when these houses were built with porches, they were one of the major social centers of the house. We didn't have air conditioning, so in the evening people went out on their porches. They waited there until mosquitoes got too bad or they had to go to bed. But they would holler at the neighbors across the street. They would talk to the people walking by. And remember, back in those days, people were moving a lot slower. You could go by in your carriage or whatever, and still carry on a conversation for 15 or 20 seconds with the person on the porch. Well, those days are long since gone, and people have moved to patios and decks on their backyard. And as a result, porches play a much less important role in houses today. The primary role today of a porch is actually giving a house a sense of entry and aesthetics. But it's still an extremely important role, especially for the Victorian houses of the area that we have here in Mount Vernon. So I'm going to fly through the first part of this presentation because I didn't realize when I put this together that I only allowed myself a half an hour for these presentations, and I've got about 45 minutes worth of slides. So I'm going to go through the first part, which is sort of a description of all the different types of porches and their components, and then I'll get to the part on things you should and shouldn't do relative to restoration. So if somebody can get the lights. Porch configurations, and again you'll see almost every one of these somewhere in Mount Vernon. First one is the basic simple rectangular porch that's added typically to the front of the house. Usually they stop short of the end of the house. They run almost all the way across and stop 2 or 3 feet short. Here's a classic example. Now within each one of these porches you'll see a lot of variations, whether it be in the columns, the balusters, the skirts, but we'll talk about each one of those elements as we progress through the slides. Roof pitches are very low, not slow, I'm getting slow. Roof pitches are quite low. The gable ends on porches usually aren't expressed. Usually the porch returns so that you have a 3-sided hip roof on most porches if it's freestanding in front of the house. There's another one. Again, this is an old 4-square house, but the porch adds a new dimension. It casts a deep shadow line across the house. It adds a 3rd dimension that comes out in front of the house. Here's one that's been altered. Our general recommendation is not to enclose front porches, but inevitably it does happen, and when you do that, we ask that you do it in such a way that it still makes it look like a porch. You can actually enclose a porch and make it totally livable space, conditioned space, and still maintain the porch feel as long as you maintain the column lines and make it as much glass or openness as possible. Now this is just closed in as a screen porch. Now here's an unusual one in the fact that it actually goes all the way to the edge of the house. As you can see, when that happens, you have a unique situation with the roof. How do you handle that roof when it comes back and meets the house? Maybe we've got a carpenter here that maybe can tell us how he handles that later. This looks like the same porch, but there's a little variation here. You see in the front of the porch, there's been a little gable added to replicate what happens behind the house, and this helps bring attention and focus you on the center of the porch where you enter it. In this case, it's on the side, but either way, you have a basic simple porch which now they've added something to in order to focus your attention on where you enter that porch. Next one is actually where they take that same element and extend it outward from the porch. Brings even more emphasis to it. And here's one that wraps around and then extends out a little bit further. Another one that extends out beyond the basic frame of the porch that helps draw more interest to the front of the porch. Now this is interesting. I was involved a little bit with this project, but there's totally two different styles of porches on this house. You look at that little upstairs porch in that little nook up there with the rounded arches, etc. And then you've got the big porch down below. We've got photographs of that original of the house, and the new porch that was put on was restored almost to the exact detail to what was existing there, and that little porch on the upper floor was there too. That goes to, I think that shows that this probably wasn't an architect designed house, at least I hope it wasn't, because typically an architect wouldn't do that. They'd carry through the same thing upstairs and downstairs. But in these types of houses, a lot of times the people that were designing them picked elements they liked off of different houses out of a pattern book, and the carpenter's job was to combine all of those into one element in one building. Now we start getting into the wraparound porches. And here we've got a porch that wraps or goes across the front of the house and then wraps around the side. A lot of times the public entrance would be in the front, and then you'd wrap around the side, and there would be a private entrance around the side where the family could enter the house. We have some great looking porches here in Mount Vernon, and this is one of them. Before it is the owner of this house here. Good. It got a new paint job. This is the before, and you now it's got sort of a purple color to it. Another form of that porch, this is sort of an inset porch. Doesn't wrap around anything. It extends into a recess that was created in the building. The Dillard house, the Boyd house, whatever the succession is, on the left-hand side there, it has a porch which actually fits into the inside. If you remember the lecture this morning, I said this is an excellent place if you want to put an addition on your house. The little inset in an L shape in a house is an excellent place to add an addition, because that's typically where a porch was located, and so adding an additional mass to the house in that location isn't noticed nearly as much. Another type of inset porch. You can see why we had a Pleasure of Porches tour, because we could go for 4 or 5 years and cover 8 or 10 or 12 different porches and never have to view the same one twice. Plus it gave people an incentive to fix their porches up. I think there's a lot of porches in town that got paint jobs and fix-ups just because we were having our Pleasure of Porches tour. I think we ought to start that again. This is an inset porch. This is the bungalow-style house that Dick showed earlier. Here you see the porch is actually encompassed within the main roof form of the building. You saw that a little bit in the earlier style of house, but when you get close to the turn of the century through the 20s, you see a lot more of this style. And this is the final style, which is actually a total inset porch. In other words, the front of the house is flush, but the porch actually sets into the house itself. So if you were on the upper floor, you actually would have a cold area below you. And I'm sure you'd notice that if you have a porch like that. And this is one example I found of it in Mount Vernon, where the porch is cut into the house as opposed to extending out in front of the house. Another example where it's actually incorporated into the roof form. All right, that's sort of the overview of different types of porches. The next part, I'm going to go through the different elements of a porch and how each one is important, and some of the designs of each one. Foundation, of course, is a critical part of any porch. In some of the older houses, the foundation was so simple as they just threw a rock down, a big flat rock, and build the house or the porch right on top of it. That, of course, is not adequate because that rock is going to go move up and down as frost comes in and out of the ground. But what we recommend, the ideal foundation is to take a concrete pier, dig a hole, sink the concrete pier at least 42 inches below grade so you get below frost. It should be at least 8 inches in diameter, probably 12 is better. And I recommend that you form the top of it purely for aesthetics. It doesn't need to be that way, but it looks a lot better if you form the top of it. And the top of it should extend 6 to 8 inches above grade, because any wood that you put on top of that, even treated wood, I recommend that you keep it up at least 6 or 8 inches above grade. Otherwise, treated wood is great wood. It's supposed to last 40 years. Well, you don't want that porch to rot in 40 years. You want it to go as long as the house is there. You can bury treated wood inside of the concrete, but I don't recommend it. Pardon? We don't have termites, but that's another good reason to keep everything at least 6 or 8 inches. Well, there are termites in some parts of town. We don't have it's not a serious problem, but that doesn't mean it won't be. Here's your concrete pier. This one in this porch is not, it should be higher off the ground in order to keep the wood higher, and it's purely an aesthetic thing, but I like to see the top of the pier formed. You don't have to, you can take a post hole digger and dig it into the ground. I don't care about that, but all it takes is a nice little form that's 8 inches high. You set it on top of the dug hole or just before you fill the top part of the concrete, and fill that part up, and at least you have a nice looking pier at the very top. The next part as you move up on the porch are the skirts. That's the part that encloses the area underneath the floor. It's important that be kept open so that air can move through that and you don't have the floor rotting out underneath you. Typically they're a vertically oriented board. They may be either slatted, or in Mount Vernon you see a lot of different boards that have different sawn patterns in them. Like I said, it has to be kept open for air circulation. In most cases, the columns, as they come down above, are usually expressed down to the foundation. In other words, you have a column, the column is expressed down to the foundation underneath that. It's quite noticeable if you don't express that, and I'll show you a couple of examples where that occurs. Again, hold the bottom 4 to 8 inches above the ground. And here's an important thing too, plant materials. A lot of times you add plant materials to the base of the house, helps soften the look, but you don't want to keep the plant material too close to that porch because the plant material holds dew, it keeps wet. When it rains, it holds the rainwater, and if that's laying up against that skirt board of the base there, then you're creating an environment where rot's going to take place more often. So if you use planting material near your foundation, hold it back so that it ideally is not touching the skirt or any part of the wood for that matter. Again, you could do a book just on the different skirt boards. I don't know how many there are in Mount Vernon. I know I used to count gable in shingle patterns, and I stopped at 8 or 9 of those different types of patterns. I think in terms of the skirt board, there's probably 40 or 50 different designs in Mount Vernon. This is one place where the carpenters who did this, they could let their imagination grow wild, and I think they did, and it really adds a lot to the diversity of the porches that we find here. This is a much simpler one, probably a newer one, because the boards are more solid, but still it adds a pattern. I mean, it's a sawn, they drilled and cut the patio. They probably drilled 4 holes and then connected them with a jigsaw, I suppose. Here's that big porch we saw earlier, a different pattern, but again, they're going to have some problems down in the future because their mulch goes up against the wood. I don't care whether it's redwood, cedar, treated, or whatever it is. You're asking for problems, number one, with moisture, and fortunately we don't have a serious termite problem in Mount Vernon, but if you did, you would never know it because the termites would get up inside there and they'd be throughout the entire porch before anyone ever knew it. So try to keep your skirt boards, and you'll see a couple other examples, up 6 to 8 inches off the grade. Here's one that is off the grade, and they've got some plant material, but this type of plant material, the annuals that come up and die, I'm not too concerned about that. It's the perennial stuff or the evergreens that have a tendency to grow bigger than what you thought they were when you put them in there that you have to worry about. But again, here's another beautiful little pattern, sort of a heart pattern combined with a diamond. Next thing is floors. A critical element, obviously. Always slope the floors away from the house. It may seem like a fairly fundamental issue, but I went by a house in Cedar Rapids, and I wish I'd gotten a picture of it before it rotted away. But they jacked the floor up so it was level. I suppose somebody thought, gee, the outside of that porch is settled. Let's jack this up and make it level, and it looks so strange to see it that way. My eye has gotten used to seeing porches slope, but they're sloped for a reason. Water is going to get on that porch, and the slope is to get the water off. So that's number one. Number two, to make it look right, most of the porches have narrow boards, 3 and 4 inch boards. They do make a treated flooring board, which you can use in porches, which will last a lot longer. This may seem fundamental too, but the joints in the board should be parallel to the slope. You don't run them back and forth, because otherwise you have a groove to stop the water as it's going down, down the face. So it should dry slope to the outside, overhanging the board slightly at the outer edge of the porch. And here's another recommendation: is on those boards, I don't care what kind of wood it is, that ingrained always has a tendency to want to suck up the moisture. And if you walk around any porch in Mount Vernon, you'll probably see if there's rot, that's the first place it's going to occur. So I recommend before, be very liberal with the primer or whatever you're going to put on there to seal those end grains, because that's the watershed. The water runs down, it's going to stop there and then sit until it drips off. So it's going to have plenty of opportunities to get sucked back up into the floorboard itself. I forgot to bring it. I've got a book of some company out of Texas makes a little book on porches, and it has a lot of good framing details in it, and it has all kinds of sawn ornament that you can buy to put on your porch. But this is one of the details that came out of it. You wonder, okay, so if the boards have to slope this way, but yet typically you want the structure to span that way, how do you frame that? Well, typically you have cross pieces that come between the floor joists, so you have something to nail the boards to. This is the way they're supposed to look. This porch didn't settle, or it may have settled a little bit, but it was supposed to slope that way. Moving on up the porch, the next area are the rails and balusters. They're almost always present. You see a few porches around town that don't have them. Whether they never had them or not, I don't know. I didn't inspect them close enough, but generally speaking, almost all porches have the balusters. They're usually turned, square, or sawn. They're usually thicker than those used for interior balusters, and I'll show you a couple examples. You go into Menards and you buy the stair rail and you put it on your porch. It doesn't look right. The proportions aren't right. The interior stair rails are much taller and slenderer than what was typically used on a porch, and you can tell that when I point it out in some of these examples. Always have a top and a bottom rail. Don't put that porch post directly down onto the floor. It's going to rot out in a fairly short period of time. And stair rails, the rails are, when they're constructed, they have some very specific details which probably aren't repeated very much anymore. But if you look at those details, they're designed to shed water. You have a bottom rail which is off of the floor, usually again 4 to 6 inches. You have a cap over that which is designed to shed water. The balusters come down on that cap, and when you go to the top, you have a similar scenario. In other words, you have a handrail across the very top which is designed to shed the water and drop it down before, so it doesn't run down the balusters. Again, this is, as I say, this is expensive to repeat details like that. So our recommendation, obviously, if you have a baluster now, do everything you can to save it, because it's probably better than anything you're going to replace it with, unless you want to spend the kind of money it takes to do one like this. Here's one of those porch rails. This one uses square balusters, and when you look at that, if you were to put a tape measure on that, I'm sure you'd find those aren't 2x2s. Those are probably a full 2 inches. The scale and proportion of balusters is a little heftier and thicker than what you would get using traditional materials today. Here's one that uses a combination of a turned area and a sawn board to create it. Creates an entirely different feeling on that porch. And I believe in this one that spindle is probably repeated in the frieze of the porch itself up above. Here's a very simple rail. They don't always have to be a balustered rail. This one has horizontals, which is quite unusual, but it has them. And in between that, they have some sawn ornament, which I believe is replicated elsewhere on the house. Quite often, they took detail from the house and pulled it down into the porch and replicated some of the things there. So that's one way of doing a relatively inexpensive rail restoration. This one is on Dick's old house, and I think this is the only one like this. It looks like it's a simple turned rail, but it isn't. This is a band sawn ornament that actually had to be run through a saw 4 times to get this type of arrangement. Quite unusual, and it's probably the only one in town that I'm aware of. And I have to give Dick credit for paying somebody to make all of his replacements. Next thing are the columns and piers. They may be single, they may be grouped together. You almost always see a half column at the wall. In other words, it didn't, when that porch was dying into the wall, it just didn't die into the siding. There was an expression of that porch as it hit the wall. They can be square or round. We have a wide variety of column types in the columns or in the porches we have here, and we have them that are both half height and full height. I'll show you some examples of all those. This is a large square one, really a handsome square pier, and with the actual panel look to it. Almost all of the columns had a base and a capital, especially if it was square. Now the turned columns usually were turned out of a piece of 5-inch square material, and so it didn't really have a wider base or capital. But this type, the round ones and the big square ones, a lot of times had a capital and a base with it. And here you see a capital at the top and a base at the bottom. And in this case, the porches, the piers are expressed in 2s or 3s. Structurally, it's not necessary, but they did it for aesthetic reasons. Here's the half-high column. Leah mentioned that somewhere we have some concrete block. Now, this is a case where they actually used some concrete block up to a point and then went wood from beyond that. And we have some very unusual and crafty type of columns also. I've never seen one quite like this before. It's hard to describe, but it's sort of a Moorish influence, I guess. But it's quite unusual. It's fun just to drive around. I mean, I've lived here for 25 years, and until I get involved in a project like this, and I'm looking for specific details like this, it's amazing how many things escape your eye that you didn't realize were there. I mean, entire houses, let alone details. Here's a case of the half column being applied to the house that terminates the porch. Again, you see that quite often, and in fact, if you were to look at your own house, if there's not a porch there now and you look at your house, you may be able to tell where a half column might have been applied at one point in time in the past. Now anybody notice anything unusual about this porch? There's no beam running around supporting the porch. I'd like to dig into that and see what. But that's very unusual. This is the only instance in town I've seen where there isn't a frieze or a board that goes around at the top of the column supporting the rest of the porch. Very unusual. I'm sure it's hidden up inside there, but still, it's just unusual. The next part, we're moving on up the porch, is the frieze and ornament. Now we'll get into the real gingerbread type of stuff that's up near the top. Several different types of ornament can be found there. The dental ornament, the reason they call it dental is because it looks like teeth. You can use old stuff, but now they've got some good synthetic products. If you look out on the Hills Bank, that's got a synthetic dental ornament, and you can buy it in a variety of different sizes and shapes. So if your porch had this type of ornament on it, you can have a carpenter make it, but buying one of these plastic products which take paint real well and will never rot begins to make some sense. I haven't seen any egg and dart, but there probably is some somewhere. And festoons and garland. Does anybody know the difference between a festoon and a garland? A garland actually uses flower. It's these little drape things that you see applied. The garland uses flowers, and the festoon uses fruit, if I remember right. Now you know that. Spindles and brackets are also something you see quite a bit on porches. Here's the sort of this is out of that book, but these are the details of the top of the porch. The spindled rails up there, brackets, usually two different types of brackets. One that attaches to the overhang or the eave line, and a lot of other times you had ones down that went from the column to the beam or to the spandrel itself. Almost looks like it came out of that pattern book. But this is where the porches, like I say, you can take a simple building and add an elaborate detailed porch, and there's quite a few of these in Mount Vernon where the building itself is quite simple, but the porch just makes it. Now this is a nice house to start with, but the porch is even nicer. And it pays to maintain these because the cost of replicating something like this or reconstructing something like this is prohibited for most people. The last one had a lot of turned elements in it, but some sawn ornament. This one is all sawn. This picture I wanted to show, this isn't egg and dart, I don't know what the proper term for this is. You see up in the, at the junction between the spandrel beam and the eave, there's an ornament applied up in there. Egg and dart would be a typical ornament to put up there. This isn't egg and dart, but it's similar in many respects. This is a garland. There is a festoon somewhere in town. I can't remember where it's at. I think the house over in A Avenue has a festoon. And the ceiling and roof, obviously the least dramatic part, but certainly one of the more important parts. If you're doing the underside of the ceiling, the best material, the most authentic material to use is the beaded ceiling board. It looks like wainscoting if you use it on the inside of the house. Porch roofs typically are much lower sloped than the actual structure itself. Most of them are hip roofs, although you occasionally see a gable or at least a projecting gable. And the overhang is usually narrower than that on the main house simply because the porch, from the scale of the house to the porch is a much smaller structure, therefore the overhang is scaled down appropriately. Framing a roof isn't anything particular. Usually they're attached to the structure itself. If you're attaching a new porch, typically you put a beam and make sure that you screw through or you hit a joist or something, and then use joist hangers or something like that to attach it. I happened to catch this one in the middle of construction, and actually it came out quite well. I think I have a finished version of it later. This probably wasn't the original porch. This probably only had given the style of house, it probably only had a porch that, at most, a porch that went across the front, but at least they did it in a style that was appropriate. Beaded ceiling, this is what it looks like. You've seen it on the inside of a house. You've seen it probably in, it looks like wainscoting material. In fact, if you walk into the lumber yard, the two terms are pretty much interchangeable. You see it a lot of commercial buildings downtown. If you remove whatever ceiling's there now and look up to the top, if it isn't a tin ceiling, then it probably is a beaded ceiling. Still a lot of it around. I'm not sure why I've got this one in there again. I guess I'm just showing a spattering of some of the porches throughout town. This has got sort of everything in it. It's got ornament in the top. It's got some large brackets. Okay, lastly, we're going to get into some do's and don'ts on porches. Before you begin, number one, let's assume that the porch, the original porch is gone, or the porch that's there is not maybe the original one. It's something that was put on in the 50s. Before you do that, look around for signs that there was a porch there. A lot of times if you got the original siding, when somebody repainted it or patched it, they probably didn't quite get all the paint off, where the original porch met the old one. So look at the original house, look at the foundation, see if you can tell where the original porch may have framed into the house. That'll give you some idea as to the scale of what should go on that house. Secondly, check historic resources, photographs, newspapers. A lot of slides of buildings, information about buildings is found in looking at old photographs. And what's interesting is it may be by accident that you find what you want. Somebody may have taken a picture of Aunt Martha standing on the porch. They were really interested in Aunt Martha, but at the same time they happened to record the porch. So take a look. You may not have remembered having a picture of the house, but there may be one somewhere in your archives or whoever the original owners of that house were. So make sure you ask whoever had the house before you or the original owners if they have any photographs that might show the house in the background. And lastly, look around your neighborhood and see what else is being built. Chances are all the houses in your neighborhood were built by any one of 2 or 3 different contractors. The types of designs and motifs that they were using can probably be found elsewhere. And if you're looking to put a porch on and you don't have any record as to what was there, using something that can be found elsewhere in the neighborhood is appropriate. Some do's and don'ts on porch construction. Number one, don't use wrought iron columns. Historically, they aren't appropriate. They dramatically change the aesthetic appeal of the porch. It's just something that's to be avoided at almost all costs. If you've got them, clad them. I've got a 50s ranch home that has wrought iron posts, and I clad them in wood. I hated them so bad. Try to avoid exposing plywood anywhere. Plywood as a material just doesn't impart the type of character and scale. The only possible exception would probably be the ceiling, but even there, again, when you saw the picture of the beaded ceiling board, it certainly isn't going to impart the same look and feel that a beaded ceiling would. 4x4s, use them with caution. If you go around and measure some of the old porch posts, you'll find that they weren't 4 inches, they're probably 5 to 6 inches. And when you put a 4-inch post in, it just doesn't look the same. Now you can buy turned porch posts today, but if you have to use a 4x4, consider maybe cladding it in another piece of redwood or something to actually get the scale of the post in closer proportion to what would have been there and what's in better proportion with the porch. Try not to use stair balusters. I pointed out earlier, and I'll show you a couple examples shortly. They're much too tall and skinny for what would have been on that porch. Don't combine details and elements from different styles. Once you pick a style to go on your house and find out what should have been there, stick with the elements that are appropriate to that style. And lastly, avoid precast if at all possible. I realize that precast will be there forever, but so here's one that uses wrought iron, and you can just tell by looking at this the difference between wrought iron, and there's a couple other examples here in wood. Another one, they replaced the deck. Now the deck I'm not as strong on. In fact, if you wanted a concrete deck, you could probably put some nailers in there and come back and put a wood skirt around that, and no one would know the difference. So on concrete decks, I'm not nearly as adamant on, but the wrought iron for the post as well as the rails just doesn't quite cut it. And unfortunately, this is probably the worst example in town. Wrought iron, but not only did they use wrought iron for the original post, and I think I got a better picture, but they also they removed the deck totally. So the entire front of, you got a beautiful house here with most of the detail preserved, but the porch just dominates everything, or the lack thereof. So they removed the floor system, they put wrought iron in, and then they put precast steps with wrought iron. So this pretty much covers the don'ts. Although here's another one. If you're going to enclose a porch, make sure that you express the floor line and the column lines. If you do that, there's a much better chance that it'll still look like a porch, and you can still enclose a porch. I'm not totally against enclosing porches, but still make it look like it could have been a porch. And this one here, the windows don't come out far enough to give you the feel that there's columns there, even though there probably are. And then you totally lost the floor line here. So try to express the floor line and the columns if you're going to enclose a porch. And here's another one. They expressed the column lines, but they missed the floor line. Actually, I think all you would have had to have done here is come back over the outside of this one and put another board, and you would have expressed the floor line. You still could have done that. Oh, this one here. That last one broke a lot of rules, but this one I think breaks even more. But this house was really dilapidated, and I have to give them credit. They came back, and probably if they hadn't done something, it wouldn't even be here in another few years. But this is where I hope that at least if we educate people as to what's right, maybe they wouldn't do some of the things that they're doing. The treated wood here doesn't really cut it. Even if you use treated wood, that's fine, but give it a stain or a coat, a paint of some kind to make it blend in. A deck on the front of the house just doesn't quite do it. A deck on the second floor, which projects out further than the extension of the roof on the upper floor. The use of the tall, spindly, go around and look at one of the older houses, measure the height of the rail, and this is probably a good foot above that. Now, it probably meets OSHA, but I think we can probably get an exception on, I don't think OSHA really covers you on porches. I liked that so well I had to get another picture of it. Ah yes, and there's the colonial revival, or the southern antebellum type of thing. This is a case of using an inappropriate form on a porch. This one does it all too. The columns are a little spindly relative to the height. I mean, if you're going to do something like that, do it right. There probably, in an antebellum home, there probably would have been a balcony at the second level, which would have helped the scale immensely. I'm not saying you couldn't do this right, but this wasn't the right example. And then there's the barn one, which I showed you earlier. I don't know whether they keep hay up there or not. And I think one of my last don'ts is don't enclose in the porch an inappropriate material. This uses the concrete, sort of perforated concrete blocks. I'm sure it cuts down on air movement through there, but it doesn't really look right. And don't remove the porches altogether. This had a nice little porch, and I don't know what you call this. The door isn't appropriate, and leading up to it isn't either. But now this might look good in a 17th century home in New England, but I doubt it. So some of the do's on porch is restore versus replace whenever possible. Not only for a cost scenario, but just it's hard to duplicate those materials. If you can't save the porch, probably there's still some ornament there. At least save the ornament to be used as a pattern so you can replicate it, or possibly even reuse some of it. Use a design that's appropriate to the neighborhood, so that you look around, see what else is being done, or whatever else was done for houses of your age group in the area. Pay attention to scale. This is in particular with regard to the columns and the rails. Use cedar or redwood on anything that's going to get exposed to moisture. Treated wood is okay also, but again, you need to paint them. And enclose it with care if you're going to enclose it. Here's one that was enclosed, but notice the column lines are clearly evident. They basically filled the area between the columns. Now, this was probably enclosed 40, 50 years ago. And you know where the floor line is at because the skirt boards are. They didn't take the siding and extend it all the way down to the ground. This is a deck that's put on a porch, but because of the detailing and everything else, I think it was a successful deck addition to the house. And I may have showed you this one earlier because they broke up the roof form, but the porch here actually helps also break up that massive addition that was put on the back of the house. In some cases, porches can even hide even bigger sins. This is the travel company. There's still some things. It'd be nice to put some shutters on the second floor of that to help break up the white expanse. But this house actually had, that second story overhangs the first story by about 2 feet all the way around. And basically we used the porch there to basically hide that fact, because that really looks strange when you have that. So they needed a ramped entry to get into it. You can't even, other than seeing the sloping handrail back there, you can't even tell that there's a handicap accessible ramp in this building. And then the porch helps hide what happens on the second level. And again, the rail here is tall, but yet it isn't too tall. And they express the floor line, and they got a nice skirt board. So I think this is a very nice job. And of course, this one here, if you really want to go all out, this is a total restoration. There was not a porch on this house for probably 30 or 40 years. So this was built from the ground up, and this is, but in this case they had the original photographs, and it was replicated to the extent possible that you could do that from the photograph. So that's Porches. I have John Sandberg, who is a local carpenter. In fact, he's done some of these jobs, I think. But he and I will entertain questions that you might have relative to porches or any other aspect of restoration. Yes? Replacement columns? You'd have to call me at the office, but again, this company in Texas, I know they make a whole series, not only columns, but they also, not only do they make columns, but they also make, you know, the fretwork and the spindles and all those types of elements. I believe there is. Guy, do you have something to add there?
Well, I use replacement columns for brick columns. I just started getting antique places, and I've gone all over the place, and all of a sudden I ran into Gary Whiter at the gas station. I asked him if he was where he got it. He says, well, I got a half dozen in my garage. Two of them matched perfectly with what I already had. So, you know, that's an easy way on a Sunday afternoon to get a bunch of antiques.
Yeah, there's an antique place down between here, just south of Solon, that carries some architectural parts. When I lived out in the country, I had about 50 of them out, and I picked them up at an auction. They were going to throw them away, and I said, well, I'll throw them in the back of the pickup, but I don't know where they're at now. I left them when I moved.
Classical porch, and I'm concerned because it's just been restored totally. And I'm concerned because I feel like I should rubberize or something that flat roof area. I don't want water leaking down into all of that new fretwork and what have you.
How low a slope is the...
The neoclassical one.
So it's basically a flat roof.
It's flat.
In that case, I would use, I mean, what did you put on the rubber roof? I mean, it doesn't matter. You want something there that's going to totally repel the water.
Right.
And the rubber roof form will work there. I mean, the membrane roofs.
By the door on the second level, we can use for ventilation. But I worry because that's all just going to be done. And if I get any leakage down through there, it's going to wreck all that fluid in there again. So I'm wondering if it's okay to do that.
What's on it now?
Almost like tar paper maybe?
Tar paper? Yeah, maybe it's roll roofing. Roll roofing.
Could be granulated.
Yeah, it could be roll roofing, which is like shingles except it comes in rolls. And that's not bad. I mean, the rubber roof would be the best scenario there, where a fully adhered system that's flashed up into the house, and you'd never, again, that's a totally modern material, but on a flat roof, no one is ever going to see it. The only thing you'll see is probably at the edges where it wraps up into the house, the termination bar. Unless you got any other ideas.
No, and there's also it's a polyester. That's on yours, yeah. Instead of the rubber, it's just another option, but it's actually a material. It's like a polyester roll material that. Yeah, it's actually thinner than the rubber, but it's a different system, but it comes with about the same warranty. Yeah, you can walk on it, but
Unless you're wearing
anything you
golf
don't.
shoes.
Yeah. Any of those, I don't think you want to be on a lot. I mean, the less you're on it, of course, the better. But yeah, you can get out on it if you have to.
Yeah, once you get under a 312 pitch, then you probably should look at some of the alternative roofing materials. Number one is you're not going to see the roof at a pitch that low, and number two is water sits on roofs like that too much. So you really need to look at some of the modern materials when you get to a very low pitch roof like that.
This is just a comment. If you're going to enclose a porch, to be aware that if someone comes along and wants to put it back to its original style, that you're going to enclose it, make it so that the next owner or you yourself may be able to take it apart without any damage.
Now that's a good point on any thing that you do to your house, especially if it's not a restoration, if it's something you've added to the house that wasn't original. If it's at all possible, make it so it's undoable, because you may like it, but the next person that buys that house may have liked it back in its original state. And that's why we say don't remove detail. If you cover it up, that's fine. Well, it's not fine, but cover it up. And I think we're hoping, is Lee still here? Lee's gone. Lee Niederhaus is building downtown. We're hopeful that all the detail that was there is still there, and it's covered up with a tin siding, and it's been there for so long that nobody remembers whether the detail's there or not. We hope it is. But the only nice thing they ever did is hopefully not tear it off, so that when we take the siding off, all we have to do is restore what's there. We don't have to replace it or try to reconstruct it.
Are you taking it off?
No. Who knows?
here?
We're new owners of the older home, 1890s home, and we were ones that thought the front porch had fallen in it. But what do you use on the front porch so it's not so slippery? They freshly painted it and it is so slippery to walk. Does everybody have a rug that goes?
They do make some grit material. You used them on the ramp, didn't you?
Yeah, and I gotta say, I don't know that I'm totally happy with it,
Yeah.
to be quite honest with you. Yeah, it's still slicker, and unfortunately, you know, those porch, the paints they use, the floor and porch enamel it's you know, the sheen, it's so darn glossy, it's a problem.
So you can get some traction that they're using in.
Then it's gritty, and it
so
gets,
slippery.
I'm slippery, the same thing, I'm hoping my porch floor is gonna be redone this summer, and its paint is down. I haven't touched years I've had the house because I despise the painted floor. I'm just letting it peel and do horrible things, make myself do it. And what I've been investigating, and I've talked with every paint place, this half of Iowa into Illinois, I think that Cabot does a product of all the people that I've talked with that will do it. It's a stain that is really opaque. And the samples I've seen in a couple of places where I've seen where it's applied, it looks as if it's not slippery.
Let me ask you, how much does your porch slope?
Maybe it has.
I was gonna say, 2 inches is a fairly, 2 to 3 inches is a typical slope from the house to the outside. If you're at 6 inches, then perhaps you do have some settlement, and in that case, it would be acceptable to, to raise it a little bit. You shouldn't have to have a rope hanging alongside the house in order to get off the.
Donna?
Also, a cleaner paint in Cedar Rapids is their, I believe it's Pratt Lambert paint, but they do have a porch and floor paint that is not high gloss, and we put that on our porch this fall. And the main thing about that, you may have to, with a porch and with your steps, is a maintenance thing every year. Put a coat of paint on it, one coat of paint to maintain it, but it isn't a high gloss.
That was, if everybody heard that, it was a Pratt and Lambert paint from Klingers. It's not quite so glossy.
Porch roofs and the ceiling to a porch don't breathe. Is there an inherent rot problem in porch roofs, or is that just in our house?
There shouldn't be an inherent rot problem unless there's moisture getting in there at the roof line. On the inside of a house, the reason you have to have those breathe is you have a tremendous amount of moisture being generated just by the people and the activities that occur inside the house. So that escapes up into the roof, and you've got to vent that out of there. On a porch, you don't have, the only source of moisture getting in that porch is probably moisture that's leaking, perhaps leaking in at the roof line. And of course, again, the outer edges where it drips, depending on how that's, if you don't have a drip cap or whatever, that's always an area that can rot. But chances are you've got some moisture coming in from somewhere.
But you don't need to design this off of that.
No.
Do all porches have to lead to a door, or instead of like putting in a cement patio, do they have a covered porch area that doesn't lead to a door to the home?
I don't know.
Never done one like that.
Yeah, a porch that doesn't take the floor, they call them
They're uncommon in the north, but yeah, could be done.
So you're talking about, there's still a door that comes onto the porch somewhere? No. So you actually have to go outside to come in and get on the porch.
outside to get on, instead of like having a cement patio out at the side of the house or something, you have this bare wall, but you have a porch there. That's an attached gazebo. Yeah, like an attached gazebo.
It's a shed.
I'd have to look at the,
Yeah.
yeah. I mean, if there was a spot that looked like, a porch could have been there, then I suppose you could, maybe you could put a foul door in too. Yeah.
Another maybe a silly question, but do porches have gutters? Are they supposed to catch the rain, or is the rain supposed to just go on?
You see them both ways. If it doesn't have a gutter, then your flowers are going to get watered. Yeah. It's fine to put a gutter on, but you have a lot of porches that don't have gutters too. The main benefit of a gutter, at least on a house, is it gets the water away from the foundation of the house and help keep it from getting into the basement. If you don't have a gutter on your porch, at least you probably don't have to worry about it running back into the into the basement. So you can go either way on that.
But it's gonna rot your foundation faster.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, move the water away from the house. And gutters were often built in from my house in Foursquare. The gutters were built into the roof. Now, that's long gone. And when I completely rebuilt the porch, there was nothing but rot in there. So I rebuilt the whole roof. But those gutters were in the roof. Now, I would say there's a reason for that. It wasn't just to save rainwater because it was soft and somebody needed it, and they had a sister to do all that, they could have gotten it, they didn't need it for the porch. It's to keep that moisture running away from the house. Because most of the problem with porches are moisture problems or ventilation problems. Keep that air moving and dry air underneath the porch is going to last a long time. But they sit close to the ground, and the minute that water's going to seep someplace into the post or into your skirt, the bottom of your skirt or someplace. You definitely, I would say, that one of the problems for a lot of times people planted far too much stuff around the house, and you don't get that ventilation under the porch. The plantings on the front of a porch need to be very low. So again, it's water and ventilation. You can solve those two problems. And gutters are an easy way to solve one.
Is there any place in Mount Vernon that is a depository for historical photographs of houses in Mount Vernon? So if you want to add a porch onto your home that you think perhaps used to have a porch, there's someplace you can go and try and find a picture of your house. Original owners are certainly all dead.
The library has a huge stash of
Really?
photographs.
Now, the library collection, 90% of it's Cornell. We have a collection right here across the wall.
Yeah.
There's a collection here also.
There are about 300 pictures in that collection.
Our collection, unfortunately, is many more commercial projects but still, you're welcome to browse through it and see if you can find your house. Anything else you want to say? Okay, it's been a long day. I hope you've learned something. Well, it's like I say, we'll probably do this again next year if people want to. So thanks for coming, and good luck on your restoration or preservation project.